Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures, and this week I want to talk about randomly placed terrain and why it makes me twitch. So many rule sets usually have a section with some scenarios and maybe a set of rules for how to randomly place terrain so you can play a game, fictional settings, but with these scenarios, and then you randomly place the terrain down according to a set of rules, whether it's dice rolling or whatever it might be. Unfortunately, I really don't like that. You can end up with some games tables with some really bizarre terrain choices placed in an unusual way that just doesn't look geographically or even aesthetically pleasing, and I find that extremely off-putting, and I much prefer to use a real map to get a section of terrain from, or if it's a historical game, obviously I'll use historically based terrain to set up my table. Unfortunately, my inner geography nerd just can't take random terrain. You can get some real anomalous results sometimes. Escarpments that are in places that they just don't belong, or rivers that seem to flow in opposite directions despite what the terrain is. Towns that aren't anchored in the landscape on road junctions or river crossings. And I appreciate there are always exceptions to the rule in the real world, but I like my terrain on my games table to have some sort of internal logic, abide by the laws of geography, but also to look aesthetically pleasing. And some random piece of terrain that is placed like slap bang in the middle of the table because a dice roll told me to just goes against all of my principles. I'm afraid I don't really like it. It does make me sort of get a little bit angsty about it. I really don't like it at all. So I thought I would discuss this week some of the different ways by which game systems generate terrain to put down on the table, and why I think they're wrong. So I'm going to start by saying, obviously my preferred method, as I've just mentioned, is to use a real world map or a section of a real world map where the terrain and everything in it has some logic. Much preferred method for me. It usually looks good. You can always, less is more. You can always take an element out if it improves the look of the table. And you've got to think in terms of, particularly in the ancient world, armies would often try to avoid fighting in hostile terrain. Ancient armies would often try and find a nice flat plain on which to have their punch up. And in some cases, historical commanders would prep the battlefield. They would clear obstacles, cut down trees and so on to make clear lines of sight and so on in preparation for battles. And so even in more modern times, commanders have often got a particular place where they want to fight, and they've thought about it in advance. And so an example would be Wellington at Waterloo. He knew where he wanted to fall back to, should the situation arise. He had an area to fight already in his mind. He didn't just rock up at some random spot in the terrain with absolutely no clue of what was there, and a whacking great escarpment or hill or whatever it might be, slap bang in the middle of the battlefield. They already have an idea of what they want. So anomalies like that do really great on me, because I don't think they belong on the battlefield. It's different if you're all fighting for a hill, a particular terrain piece, but it needs to have some sense. And for me, that means it needs to, the overall table needs to look nice, but it also needs to have some geographical logic to it. I may only have got an A level in geography, but I did enough to know where a hill or a river belongs and where it doesn't. Then there are some rule systems where you literally just randomly dice roll to see where terrain appears on the table. It might be a dice roll for each square of the table, each quarter or something like that, or each sixth, whatever. Again, you can end up with some really random and bizarre choices that make absolutely no sense in terms of geography. But it can also end up with items that are just in the wrong place. No army would willingly fight across such terrain. And then, as I say, you can end up with things like towns that aren't anchored in the landscape, and they're not on a river crossing or a road junction. They're just slap bang in the middle of nowhere. Now, I appreciate that there are always exceptions to the rule in geography. You can always find an example of geographical features that just are somewhere that don't seem to appear, shouldn't belong there. But that doesn't mean to say generals are going to willingly fight at that location. So I do like my tables to have an aesthetic look to them, and say randomly generated in, say, boxes on the table just doesn't work for me. And neither does players alternately putting terrain down. That's another method that's often used. Each side gets X number of pieces of terrain pieces they can put down, and they take turns. They dust who goes first, and then they alternate putting pieces down. But in my experience, this is often leads to very symmetrical tables, or pieces of terrain deliberately placed to thwart the enemy. It becomes part of the tactics of the game, and that's not what wargaming for me is about. You shouldn't win or lose a game based on the placement of a hill that pops up in front of your army, for instance. So I really don't like that particular method. Equally, where you dice for the terrain to randomly go down, and then players get a chance to remove a piece of terrain. Each gets to pick one piece of terrain each that comes. Again, it just doesn't make any sense to me. And what you can be left with is, again, you can be left with the geography of the battlefield. It just doesn't make any sense. So I don't really like that method either. And then again, you can have things like scatter charts to work out where terrain is going to get placed. But again, it's random. There's no internal logic to the placement of hills and rivers and so on. And invariably, one side or other could end up seriously disadvantaged by the placement of a piece of terrain that just doesn't work. And I think as well, you end up with terrain that just doesn't look right. Particularly, I'm thinking now about the Normandy games that I've run, where they're full of terrain. There's a lot of it. There's different types of fields, there's hedgerows, there's bocage, there's bridges, rivers, streams. There'll be fences and walls. There'll be buildings, towns. Lots of terrain on a fairly small table that, if done right, looks really good. And again, I'm thinking of some demo games that you can see at shows where there's a lot of terrain down on the table, and it's really interesting, but it makes sense. It looks real because there's some internal logic to the placement of that terrain. You haven't just got stuff randomly appearing in certain places. So yeah, you probably gathered by now that I don't like random terrain. I do like my geography to make a little bit of sense. But as always, I'm going to put this out to you. What do you think? Am I just being a geography nerd? Should I get over myself? What do you think? Have you used random terrain for games? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Or do you not care? Do you like to just get something that is challenging and fight over that? Or like me, do you prefer your geography to make a bit of sense? Particularly with historical games, play across genuine historical terrain. Even if you're playing a what-if scenario, you might pick a section of real terrain from that campaign that maybe a battle wasn't fought in, but under different circumstances you're going to do this what-if game, for instance. Do you prefer that sort of thing rather than completely randomly generated terrain? As always, I'd love to know what your experience is. What games have you played? What terrain systems have you used? And what do you prefer? Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's video. I hope it's given you some food for thought, and I'll look forward to hearing your comments. And of course, if you did enjoy the video, please like, subscribe and share. And if you want to keep up to date with weekly videos, please tap the bell notification icon. So until next week, look after yourself, get in as many games as you can, and of course, keep rolling high.